So Professor Jason Weeks and I from JNCC are delighted to be here today at this session, which is looking at moving from science to policy to impact. And the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, JNCC, is the only statutory advisor to the four governments of the UK. Our mission is to turn science into action for nature, for people, and for the planet. What we're presenting today is on using evidence to provide policy advice to governments. So the first slide, thank you, Jason, has an infographic on it that really shows how pervasive plastic pollution is. You've probably heard this message time and time again. What the slide also shows is that it most often comes from land and river sources. And importantly for our presentation, it is very often visible. My professional interest in plastic pollution started a good few years ago when, as Matt mentioned, I led marine policy at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. And one of my team's very early achievements was the ban on microbeads in personal rinse-off products. Next slide, please, Jason. This ban was the first in the world. And since that time, the evidence on the presence of plastic in the marine environment has grown significantly, as has, importantly, public awareness about this form of pollution. It was in the same year as microbeads were banned, 2018, that the UK hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government CHOGM meeting, and the ocean was one of the Prime Minister's main priorities for that meeting. And it was my pleasure with my team to work across government departments to deliver a package, an ocean package, that focused on science, but also education materials, investment and events to really showcase the work that the UK had been doing to tackle plastic pollution. Please.
Gemma, have we lost you?
Oh, have you?
I think you're back.
Apologies, can you hear me?
Yes.
Next slide, please. And the Commonwealth Litter Programme CLIP tackles both land and sea sources of litter, but also addresses removal of litter and promotes science, education and outreach. It's a significant step in tackling plastic pollution of the ocean. And importantly, it became the precursor to the Blue Planet Fund, a historic £500 million investment in alleviating poverty through protecting the marine environment. And you would have heard about the Blue Planet Fund earlier from James Smith from DEFRA. CFAS is now leading on the plastic pollution element of the Blue Planet Fund's Ocean Country Partnership Programme, and JNCC is leading on marine protected areas. And we've been working at the interface between marine protected areas and plastic pollution, and have a particular interest in the cumulative impacts of pressures on the global ocean. It's only through taking a real systems approach, which is exactly what this symposium is about, to this vast and dynamic ecosystem that we will make progress on ensuring a healthy global ocean. I'll now hand over to Jason, who's going to cover some of our specific work to understand the causes and impacts of plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and good afternoon, everyone. So just moving the slides forward. So this is where it gets quite tricky in terms of what is the evidence base, in terms of informing and driving that activity around what is the policy, what should be the policy, etc. So we get into sort of uncharted territory, and JNCC have been trying to address some of these gaps in our knowledge and the uncertainty in terms of the impacts of plastics, particularly on marine protected areas. And some work that was done in 2020, where JNCC funded ABP to do a review of the impacts of marine plastic pollution on marine protected areas, really looking at the adverse impacts, and the lack of our knowledge, really, in terms of what we don't know as opposed to what we do know. And not surprisingly, what we don't know is actually more significant than what we actually really do know about the impacts on our marine protected habitats. So in terms of driving policy, and as we've heard already, evidence constitutes the basis of the policy going forward. We don't have the evidence. We don't have the information. We're just beginning to look at the benchmarks in terms of comparing and contrasting different habitats and the significance of plastic litter in this case in terms of the negative impacts, if there are negative impacts. We assume that there are because of the nature of the plastics and the materials. Very recently, CFAS have also taken samples from this area, and they've been looking at microplastics and degradation down through the profile. So what we do know, there's a huge amount of marine litter, and this isn't news to you from the last 2 days of the meetings. And we have a very robust definition of marine litter, and we have from the OSPA work, we have a set of criteria and very clear definitions as to what is a plastic type of litter, what are the metals, etc., etc. So we have marine litter without a doubt, which is being dispersed across the ocean. Here's some examples on these slides of just some nets wrapped around some corals and soft corals, and a plastic bag wrapped around a coral. And so some work again that JNCC initiated, and this was during sort of 2011, 2012, was a refresh of going back to the Darwin Mounds, a marine protected area, fairly deep marine protected area, to look at the overarching health of the coral reef and the soft corals in that system, and really trying to understand whether there were any improvements on the previous survey from 2003, which was really looking at the impacts of fishing activity. And quite surprisingly to the observers, what we found was a significant level of marine litter dispersed along the seabed at depth. And here's some examples of that. So very recognizable product brands, a little bit unsatisfactory if you happen to be a manufacturer of Doritos, but we won't mention that anymore. Other crisps do exist, of course. But we were surprised by the level of litter that we observed. We hadn't seen this previously. We hadn't been looking for it. We hadn't anticipated it. And again, we're at that stage of, well, what does this mean in terms of the actual impacts occurring to the protected habitats, to the species that are designated within that habitat. So again, lacking evidence, lacking detail in terms of actual direct impact and what the significance of this very visible marine litter is in terms of the consequences to that particular habitat. So actually, when we're talking about evidence, we have very little evidence in terms of the impacts and what perhaps the policy implications are and what we ought to be doing from a regulatory legislative format. As Gemma said right at the beginning, we are very conscious that most of the marine and most of the ocean plastics originate on land. And that's a real issue. And one of the projects that DEFRA have been, and DEFRA and JNCC have been involved in very recently, is looking at plastic nappy waste, basically disposable nappies, and looking at the dispersal in the environment where they're often, and certainly in Islamic countries, are certainly thrown away. We don't have waste collection systems, so these nappies find their ways into the waterways, etc. So we're looking at how to remove that. So there's a whole program of education, community engagement, but also trying to keep the material out of the aquatic system in the first instance by repurposing them perhaps for use in agriculture, using that medium for nutritional support of young plants and fruit trees. So again, just thinking about how to restrict in that systems approach, how to restrict the entry of plastics in the first instance into the ocean environment. Other repurposing examples, here's a really nice example from Wales where several thousand used nappies were used to actually produce the surface material for the A487. So, and a road made from nappies, which is probably a better use than throwing them into the ocean. But just stepping back, I think we need to be really pragmatic in how we look at the plastic pollution issue. No doubt, plastics are a significant input into the environment, but at the same time, I think we really need to understand and appreciate that humanity is very, very dependent on plastics, and in particularly the ALMIC countries, where a plastic bag has multiple uses. And what we're trying to think about is that there are other aspects and other priority areas in terms of pollution, alleviation, biodiversity, etc., which have perhaps been overshadowed by the plastics issue, given the uncertainty we have around the consequences of the plastic waste. And I know that's probably very controversial, but essentially what I'm saying is we need to really think about how we remove our love affair with plastics, how we think about plastics in that whole life cycle approach, the product to end, and how we dispose of our plastics ultimately. Essentially, plastic waste is a waste issue. It's not an ocean issue as such. It's about the inappropriate disposal of plastic litter over time that's created this very, very visible problem that we see now. And it's about the consumption, our continued consumption and our inadequate disposal practices that are very much at the root cause of this problem that we're seeing. And here's an example of a waste litter site in Sri Lanka with wild elephants rummaging through and consuming plastic. So in order to manage our environmental plastic issue, we need to really have very effective environmental actions to minimize the plastic entrance into the environment from different sources. And that should be the purpose of our science and our legislation in terms of the product cycle, the supply chain, removing products before they have the opportunity to enter into the environment. And just finally, just thinking about that overarching piece of work. This is some work that JNCC have been doing, looking at the IUCN Red List species, and just to demonstrate that the impacts on the global ocean are actually very much originating from land. And this just shows you the agricultural and forestry effluents as a heat map in terms of their impacts on the immediacy of the oceans in association with those countries where these products are used. And you can see quite clearly there's a massive impact in the global north and Southeast Asia. Not surprisingly, or perhaps very surprisingly, the largest contributor, this is very recent research that was published in 2020, that shows that paint is the largest contributor to microplastics in the environment. And that's quite a significant finding, and one perhaps that has not as yet been communicated or discussed in the scientific literature. So how do we legislate for that? Because I'm sure we all use paint, and we all have things that are painted in our homes, etc. And then just finally, the UN roadmap for a new global plastics treaty. This was agreed in March 2020, and it does address many of the aspects in which we've been presenting today in terms of considering the wider environment, the broader environment, the land-based sources. It's not, marine plastic should not be considered in isolation of other environments. It aims at that long-term elimination of plastic pollution. So looking at alternatives, but also not jumping on alternatives that perhaps are inappropriate or unsuitable, or actually create another problem as yet unknown. It very much encourages that full life cycle understanding of the plastic materials and making sure that they are effectively disposed of or repurposed or reused. So I'm not going to read every element of this slide, but it's very much about changing our behaviours, taking actions which mitigate the entrance of plastics and plastic waste into the environment in the first instance, rather than having to deal with the consequences of that material once it's in the receiving environment, because that is where the real issue is in terms of the evidence base to support whether an impact is occurring or not, and actually how do we resolve that issue? How do we actually remove this plastic from those deep ocean environments? And I'm not quite sure how we do that. So that's what Gemma and I had in terms of perhaps lack of data, lack of evidence, and therefore the inability to really be purposeful in our policy settings. But I think this global treaty actually really does address some of the major concerns that we have in terms of the continuous use of plastic, not forgetting that plastic is essential for many communities, and particularly in the ALMIC countries. So thank you very much.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cox as Matt kindly introduced, and in this short presentation I will offer a brief overview of Fauna and Flora International's work on microplastics, and specifically our approach to tackling pellet pollution. And I will highlight the role that different stakeholders can and have played in reversing the trend, and I will conclude with our recommended policy options that would level the playing field to ensure joined up action across global value chains on this issue. As some of you may know, FFI is a UK-based global biodiversity conservation group with a marine programme active in 20 countries. We were in 1903, and our mission is to conserve threatened species and ecosystems worldwide, choosing solutions that are sustainable, based on sound science, and which take into account human needs. Our approach to tackling plastic, and particularly microplastic pollution, is to focus on the source, with the aim of working collaboratively to develop policies and to promote practicable upstream solutions that effectively turn off the plastic tap. We recognise, and as has been discussed already today, that tackling marine plastic pollution is a vast and complicated global challenge driven by a broad array of different sources and requiring complex interaction of measures and solutions to effectively tackle it. As I'm sure you all know, in 2016 alone, it was estimated that over 20 million metric tons of plastic pollution entered aquatic systems, and this figure is projected to triple by 2040 under a business as usual scenario. We know from the literature and from the slide that Gemma just shared that over 2,000 marine species, including plankton, fish and seabirds, and marine mammals, have been found to be harmed in varying ways by plastic. And as the research in the field evolves and sampling effort increases and capacity to detect more types of plastic improves at ever decreasing sizes, that evidence becomes ever more stark. As a biodiversity conservation group, we were very concerned with emerging evidence of the scale of microplastic pollution back in 2009. The term microplastic simply means plastic pieces measuring less than 5 millimeters in diameter, and can be used to describe everything from the tiny plastic fragments that are invisible to the naked eye through to larger pieces of microplastic like pellets. It was the prevalence of microplastics in the environment, exposure to associated toxic chemicals, and the risk of ingestion by a broad range of marine life that underpin healthy marine ecosystems that indicated that there was a clear and direct threat to biodiversity that needed addressing. So one of our core areas of work is looking at plastic pellet pollution. And pellets, or nurdles for those who aren't familiar, are the building blocks of the plastic industry. They're small, they're cheap, and they're produced in their billions by oil refineries around before being transported around the world between plastic manufacturing plants. Careless handling of these pellets often results in both chronic and acute losses of pellets from supply chains, and the resulting pollution can have a significant impact on marine biodiversity. Pellet pollution is estimated as the second largest direct source of marine microplastic pollution, with estimates conservatively lying in the region of 230,000 tonnes a year entering the environment. But unlike the loss of microplastic fibres from textiles, for example, which is an extremely complex challenge, our early investigations found that pellet loss could be entirely preventable, and failing to address pellet loss in supply chains threatens to undermine a lot of other voluntary efforts that different companies have today publicly committed to as they move towards a more circular economy for plastic. And although pellet pollution has a relatively low profile in the wider plastic pollution landscape, the issue is not new, and early records of pellets polluting coastlines, waterways and protected areas date back to the 1970s. In 1995, in response to growing publicity, Operation Clean Sweep, or OCS as it's become known, was launched by two of the most prominent US-based trade associations. OCS is a flexible voluntary program designed by industry for industry to encourage better housekeeping at sites producing or handling plastic pellets. In the absence of any other best practice available, the scheme was endorsed by trade associations around the world as a solution to the pellet loss problem. But in reality, the scheme simply did not live up to its potential. Overall uptake of OCS, considering the sheer size of the plastic industry, was and still is very low. Lifetime memberships were offered to whole companies rather than focused at individual sites. There was and there is very little transparency to the scheme, and administrators offered limited support to participating companies who was seeking help in how to assess their operations for pellet loss. But crucially, we found that there was no way of verifying that pellet loss prevention measures had been implemented at the sites signing up to Operation Clean Sweep. Over time, commitment to the scheme appeared to wane both within trade associations and across the industry, and it became apparent that even where companies had signed up to Operation Clean Sweep, pellet loss continued unabated, as is highlighted by this map, which I captured earlier today from FIDRA's excellent Great Nurdle Hunt website. The different coloured flags on this map represent nurdle sightings, largely done by members of the public, and the different colours represent different concentrations across the globe, clearly suggesting that more needs to be done to tackle this issue. Simply signing up to OCS is no longer considered best practice. Pellet loss in supply chains poses a reputational risk to companies. Lost resources mean lost revenue, and failure to address systemic pellet pollution is starting to attract large fines for companies. We believe that all companies handling pellets have a responsibility to prevent loss, so we started advocating for what became known as a supply chain approach, a solution which would apply to all companies and all individual sites, regardless of size or location or affiliation to a trade association, and which would truly take into account the international nature of the problem. So what we and our partners, such as FIDRA, want to see is that all operations handling pellets are regularly audited by an accredited body to verify pellet loss prevention measures have been fully implemented. There needs to be improved communication and transparency across supply chains. And finally, there needs to be a shift in the dialogue away from cleaning up and mitigating spills to preventing pellet loss in the first place. Because once pellets reach the environment, like all microplastics, they are notoriously difficult to clean up. So in order to fully achieve this vision of a supply chain approach to pellet pollution, we saw that there was a need for an independently developed, robust standard for pellet handling. And we were delighted to see last summer the publication of the world's first discrete pellet handling standard. The PAS 510, as it's known, was sponsored by Marine Scotland, the British Plastics Federation, and a group of investor companies coordinated by the Investor Forum and represented by FFI. The standard was drafted by a broad multi-stakeholder expert steering committee and under consultation prior to publication by the British Standards Institute. The PAS marks a real step forward in approach and attention to detail that will support companies wanting to tackle pellet loss. All of the key features of the PAS are listed on this slide, but it's the last one that I'd like to draw your attention to, because the PAS requires site performance to be evaluated year on year, meaning it's no longer enough just to sign up to a scheme, and it's no longer enough just to have procedures in place to prevent pellet loss. Companies will need to monitor the effectiveness of these measures and be in improvement towards the goal of zero pellet loss. I mentioned in my introduction that I would try to convey how different stakeholders can help reverse the trend of systemic pellet loss. I think principally there needs to be an improved awareness of the scale and impact that pellet pollution has and a commitment to act. And this can't be achieved without the coordinated efforts across different sectors, including industry, businesses, civil society, governments, and policymakers. For example, I think companies handling pellets need to adopt and implement proper standards, such as the PAS, to improve transparency and build trust in their operations. I think buyers of plastic products, brands and retailers or can use their procurement policies to drive uptake of pellet handling standards throughout supply chains as part of broader commitments to circularity and waste reduction. The general public and civil society organisations should start asking questions about the products that they buy and use. Do they come from responsible companies certified against pellet loss prevention? I think there is an opportunity for scientists to continue gathering the data, evidencing the scale and impact of pellet pollution on biodiversity, both from a physical perspective and from a toxicological perspective. And finally, we believe that policymakers should introduce legislation to level the playing field by mandating that all companies handling pellets need to verify that pellet loss prevention measures are in place at all sites and at all stages of the supply chain. Ultimately, while we support the use of standards which are voluntary in nature, we do believe that legislation is needed to level the playing field across the industry as a whole. There are over 60,000 plastic companies in Europe alone. Some of these have gone to significant lengths to invest in and address the issue of pellet loss at their operational sites, whereas others continue to overlook the issue and pollution continues to stem from their sites. We believe that unless all companies are required to demonstrate that pellet loss prevention measures are in place, and in the absence of consequences for failure to comply, change on the scale needed will continue to rise. But we are starting to see a change in political interest in this area. Last year, OSPAR, the UN Regional Sea Programme for the Northeast Atlantic region, covering marine areas for 15 national administrations and the EU bloc, passed a landmark recommendation which now obligates all contracting parties to use standards and certification schemes to prevent supply chain pellet loss. France has issued a decree which introduced a legal requirement for pellet handling audits. And perhaps most significantly, the European Commission is currently consulting on measures needed to address supply chain pellet pollution, building on the concept of the supply chain approach to tackling pellet loss. If the EU commits to mandatory requirements for preventing pellet loss, coupled with fines or legal action for non-conformity, they will set a pioneering example to the rest of the world, which could be replicated in the future under the auspices of the Global Plastic Treaty. There is one remaining gap that needs to be addressed. As we've heard, over 80% of marine plastic is thought to originate from land-based sources. So most attention on the pellet loss issue has to date been focused on changing practices at sites across land and looking at standards and national or international policies where impact could be had. But pellet pollution from ships can also have a devastating impact and has largely gone under the radar until now. International maritime law is governed by the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. And in order to fully realize a supply chain approach to tackling pellet loss, it's crucial that improvements to IMO regulations are also made to join up the dots and close that gap. As global plastic production rates continue to increase in the volume of pellets being shipped around the world, and there have been a number of catastrophic and high-profile pellet spills happening at sea involving container ships in recent years. One particular incident that I wish to draw your attention to occurred in Sri Lanka nearly 1 year ago and resulted in the loss of over 1,600 tons of plastic pellets from the Express Pearl, which is considered the single largest recorded pellet loss incident from a ship to date. The impact of this spill has been extensive, spanning more than 200 kilometers of coastline, and was further complicated by the ongoing pandemic. The coast population in Sri Lanka depends on seafood as a primary protein source, but coastal fisheries were forced to close due to the level of contamination in the waters from the shipping incident. FFI and other stakeholders, including a growing support from a number of national administrations, are now working with relevant IMO committees to try to secure a reclassification of pellets. If classified as dangerous goods by the IMO, it would mandate changes in the way that pellets are packaged, labelled and stowed on container ships, with preference given for below-deck stowage. Should disaster strike again, crews and neighbouring coastal states would be better prepared to implement effective disaster response protocols, all of which are simple measures that are currently missing. We have an unprecedented opportunity to secure this change at the IMO to eliminate pellet loss not only on land but also at sea, closing the circle and effectively addressing this preventable and pervasive source of pollution across the entire global value chain. So that's it from me this afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention as I've gone through this whistle-stop tour of microplastic pollution, pellets and plans for 2022 and beyond. I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
I'll talk about my campaigns and what they have led to. In 2013 to 2017, I led campaigns calling for ban on plastic bags in Kenya, and they were quite successful. And I'll tell you how. Possibly you're wondering why I've put my social media accounts there. I have done so because that is my tool of trade. That is what I use to campaign for. Okay, so this picture I shot at Njoro River in Nakuru with two boys looking at a polluted river. You can see it, and it really disturbed my heart when I saw those boys. It was an interesting thing because I was taking the pictures of the river. Then I saw those two boys standing there looking at the picture. They did not even know that I was taking the photos. So I tried to imagine their future and the past of their parents or their grandfathers who were able to swim in that river. But these boys cannot swim in such a dirty river anymore. Why plastic? Most people ask me, why did you choose to fight plastic pollution? Why plastic and not any other thing? And I always tell them it's because of the anger that came from me, seeing so much pollution in my hometown, seeing so much plastic bags littering the landscape, the roads, everywhere. And of course you understand that plastic bags do not biodegrade. So if they are taken to a landfill or dump site, they just lie there and nothing happens to them. They take many years before they degrade, and degrading means breaking down into much smaller, dangerous plastics called microplastics, as I think Tanya has mentioned. Plastic is the most visible litter. Even in the most cleanest cities in the world, you will see plastic. You see a plastic bottle, you see a sweet wrapper, you see plastic. Plastic is everywhere. It is in the tallest mountain in the world. It is also in the deepest parts of the oceans. And sadly so, researchers just the other day, and I have been fortunate working with researchers, especially looking or studying microplastics in our lakes, found that we already have microplastics in our blood. That is something shocking. And 2 weeks after that report, another research came out saying that microplastic particles have been found deep within our lungs. So basically, plastic is, in all, it's in the environment, it's in us, it's everywhere. Plastic being very flimsy, the plastic bags that I was calling for the ban can easily be carried by wind, by water, and by other agents of nature. So really taking or controlling the pollution is quite a difficult and uphill task. Plastic is it's single use and of course not recyclable. For example, these plastic bags you see here are made of less than 30 microns, very thin plastics that cannot be recycled. And even if somebody wanted to recycle them, they need to collect so much to make economic sense. So most people do not want to engage in that kind of a loss bringing business. I have observed the plastics blocking drains, blocking sewers, and the bad thing is that when, especially in my hometown or in Nairobi, when there's a lot of and these plastic bags have blocked the drains. There is, of course, a lot of flooding, and in areas that are heavily populated, these plastic bags can cause breakages or blockages of sewer lines, and those sewer lines can cause diseases like dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and many waterborne diseases. So they can also bring about the issue of malaria, because mosquitoes love, you know, such kind of habitats that are wet. So plastics are such a big worry. They cling on trees, they pollute our rivers, like you've seen in that previous picture. And I have been able to campaign quite effectively because of my good skills. I'm bit bragging here, and it's good to brag because I know these are things that many people would love to use, possibly because of time they do not have, but I think because of the skills that I have and passion for the environment and for my work, I've been able to do these campaigns. I have a good background in communication and media, having studied journalism at the university. That is something that has really helped me, as you can see me taking a picture there with the officer of Kenya Wildlife Service, who had you know, escorted me into the park to see the state of pollution inside the protected area of Kenya. You know, and of course, having good being a photographer and skills in photojournalism, being able to blog and running social media campaigns are very good techniques in that, and also being able to network with other people. Those are a few of the skills that I have that I can brag that I've been able to bring an impact in the environment, especially in plastic campaigns. I would love to mention the campaign platforms that I've been using. Because without mentioning about these powerful platforms, I think I'll be doing an injustice. People need to know what the impact of social media, besides sharing pictures of lovely, you know, fashion and food. There is much more that we can do on social media that can bring change. And Twitter has about 400 million users. You know, just recently, Elon Musk, who is now the boss, say that Twitter is a public town square, you know, where debates are carried out, where people discuss important things, and indeed the revolutions have also come out from Twitter. So Twitter is a place that I have found, you know, good working environment. I have ran campaigns on Twitter since 2013, where Twitter was quite new, and so have grown with the Twitter, and I've found it very effective platform to not only share awareness and, you know, and teach people and all that, but also to target certain messages to the government agencies and to policy makers, you know, trying to highlight issues that needs to be changed. Facebook is quite a powerful platform too, has 2.9 billion users, regarded as most popular microblogging site, and it's followed by Instagram, which is also owned by Facebook, and with 1 billion users. All those are good platforms to use, but I have personally relied mostly on Twitter. Other platforms that I have relied on, it's newspapers, the mainstream media, newspapers, because I'm a journalist, and radio. I've been invited in radio talk shows, you know, to try to pass out my message of environmental conservation and my campaigns on plastic pollution. I've also effectively done a lot of writing petitions to the government officials, writing letters and other organizations, and also try to raise public awareness through cleanups and planting of trees. I believe in cleanups. Cleanups may not be very effective ways of addressing the issue of plastic waste, because today you're cleaning up, tomorrow the plastic is back there. But I believe cleanups are like killing two birds with one stone. On one hand, you're cleaning the environment or the river, you know, in the other hand, you're raising awareness. And through that, many people learn, especially those people who are actually doing the cleanup, those people who are watching them doing the cleanups. And me as a photographer, when I take those pictures and I share them on social media, many other people will see them, they'll be friends. and they might, feel like the need to bring change. Activism and policy. What is the connection between activism and policy? Governments have a lot of fear when they, or suspicion when they interact with activists. In fact, we are not called at policy making tables. We're never invited at such important discussions because governments fear or suspect us. They have bad ideas about activists, even when we are raising important issues. So it is important that activists are also put on the table, because these are the people, who are communicating with the community, who are raising awareness, and therefore it would be very easy for the government and the activists to work together to bring change through we use disruptive campaigns or targeted messaging. When the government is trying to share greenwashing messaging, saying that they're doing this and we know it is greenwashing, we'll try to turn around that and point out where the errors are, or what I call talking to power. With the documentary evidence, like the picture you see here, where there is a lot of plastic bottles, when the government says the environment is clean, we are doing all this, then you take a picture and share with them and tell them this is actually what is happening in the ground. You're actually doing nothing and you need to do more. By that, we keep pressuring the governments through the petitions, letters, and protests. We have done a lot of protests in my hometown, and of course we always call the noisemakers, but there is a reason to make noise. When it's burning, if nobody is making noise, people will die, and we don't want people to die. We want change that or meaningful change. Governments need to be pressured to act, and activists are the catalyst. And to sum it up, I'm trying to make it very easy on what we do. We collect evidence through taking pictures and videos. Then we go on Twitter or Facebook and other social media platforms. We do the campaigns and raise the advocacy there, all the noise. And then that leads now to policy development. We may not be invited, but we go there, but our message is heard. And I would love to end with my favorite quote by Margaret Mead, an American cultural anthropologist, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
So thank you so much for the invitation, first of all. I have to say that I have never been to any of this. I lived in London for a little bit. I was not very familiar with your institution. So thank you for the opportunity to get very, very familiar, and the opportunity to be here today. So we published this paper last year, Neglected. It took us about 2 years. This paper originally came at the invitation of UNEP, UN Environmental Program, following a presentation we had to one of the expert groups, the expert group of microplastics, a work group hosted by the UNEP. And so the important thing, first of all, I want to thank my co-authors, Juliana Khalil, Stephanie Munguia, and Christopher Chen. This was a collaborative effort over 2 years. It was supposed to take, about 4 months, but you know how these things happen. And we'll go to the next slide. So very importantly, this is the first time. It's important because it's the first time that the UN published something like this that actually looks at pollution and plastic pollution not just as a single end problem. And especially for us, as we are an ocean conservation organization in our field, it tends to be that folks only kind of think about, there's that idea of the turtle with the, very bad, right? A turtle with the straw up its nose, and we kind of go by that idea, and that is true, and that's very bad. But the problem is that by the time plastic actually gets to the ocean and the waterways has basically left a trail of destruction in its wake. And so for us, it was very important to have that conversation. Also very important to note that a lot of this work has been done for years now by folks like CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, by the folks over at Tejas here in Texas, by Rada, by Gaia. And these are folks that have been doing that work and leading on that work for years. But again, the important part was here that we actually got to get the UN to talk about this. You know, part of what happened as well is that when we started the report, it was 2019, and it took us a while, and as you can imagine, we went into 2020 where things changed quite a bit, and we actually had to go back and reassess part of the work of the literature, because all of a sudden we had a big situation to deal with. Was obviously the pandemic. There was a spike in use, and we had to look at how COVID and the emergency in this worldwide pandemic actually impacted folks, and how this, if anything, changed our conclusions. So in the original idea, like it says here, was to clarify the link to have that big picture context. Very importantly for us, and the way that we organized it, you know, if you walk into this, you could go 1,000 different ways. So the way that we organized it was, let's see if there's any impact between plastic, and I'm going to say plastic versus just plastic pollution. Because in this case, like you said, it's everything from source to waste. Any impacts that plastic has to the full and timely development of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously then what we really wanted to make sure is that this report was not just going to end up in a drawer somewhere, in a cabinet somewhere, that this was something that folks, wherever they found it, could make some use of. And so we have some recommendations at the end for just, you know, for the public, for NGOs, other nonprofit organizations, for governments, for businesses. And so there's many levels of recommendation there, from advocacy to their operations to even just their consumption, etc. So you can see that, and that's towards the end of it. And I'll go to the next slide. Go back. Oh, I'm a lot better at presentations before, I promise. So some of the things, you know, I have been working with Azul for a long time on abating or trying to diminish plastic pollution. And we had done some very important things here in California, one of which was having the first nationwide bag ban, statewide in the nation bag ban. And one of the things that happens is that there's a lot of condescension and a lot of sort of minimizing, right? And we had been doing this work when we were doing it here in California. I'm not sure how much you know of California, but we are what they call the majority minority state. That means that the majority of the population here are actually of other ethnicities. Here in California, the majority of us are Spanish speakers, actually. And there's this false understanding that people in communities of color or other cultural communities don't actually care about the ocean, or don't care about pollution. This is a very misguided, like I said, condescending idea, because there's this understanding that there's one way of doing conservation and one way of doing conservation advocacy. And if you're not part of that and you're not doing it that exact way, then you don't care. And so it's a little bit of it's not something that just comes on the producer side, it's also in our side, and thankfully part of what we are trying to move and learn as a field. So we actually had here in California this issue where folks were actually trying to say that people were too poor to care, that people were too poor to care about pollution, which is completely nuts. And that we didn't know how to use reusable bags, you know, just ridiculous and crazy fallacies all around. And it was having to have that conversation at all levels. And so we have had that conversation here in California. What ended up happening is that we did a very much a cultural based campaign. So we had, we had here in the legislature, a lot of folks that were Mexican American descent. And as we kept hearing this discussion, something finally comes to mind. They said, well, all these people, they don't know how to use reusable bags. And I just remember that my grandmother for the longest time had used, and I'm Mexican American, my grandmother had used a reusable bag in Mexico, and obviously in many places around the world, right? And so finally, one day I said, well, not only do we know how to do it, we can show you, right? And so we created this whole, and next time I'll put it in my next presentation, but we had this whole thing, which is, this is what we call the grandma bag. And we had a whole thing around that. And that's how we kind of broke down the conversation, or rather the problems in the conversation, because this is where you're going from to the impact and the policy, right? Because all of a sudden we were connecting with folks one-on-one, we were breaking down those issues like it was something that people knew, that people had heard about, that was familiar. And some of the folks that were the legislators that were voting against it before, all of a sudden kind of realized like, oh, this is actually a good idea. This is very easy. And those same people were having like press conferences with these bags. So in the end, we finalized that. But after all this, what I'm getting to is with this report, as much as we had done this work, because that work had been very focused on marine pollution, a lot of what we learned, and again, the report was very much what they call a literature review as a starting point. I didn't know a lot of these problems. For example, what you're seeing here, that 20% of all oil produced by 2050 will be used for plastic production. Other issues that came to view were, for example, the fact that a lot of plastic companies and oil companies are, first of all, as oil demand sort of lowers and is reduced in Western countries or in rich countries, they are now moving, and this is something that was reported by The Guardian and other newspapers. They're moving towards actually taking up that demand with plastic production, and B, actually trying to move that demand and stoke that demand and grow that demand in countries that are developing still. So there is, just by itself, that is an issue of environmental justice. And how do we define environmental justice here? So in the US, environmental justice has a very specific definition, and what happened was that in the US we had the environmental movement that started in the 1970s, and folks know about Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and how that came about a awakening and what culminates in the first Earth Day in 1970. But what happened with that movement is that it really left behind a lot of the communities of color and a lot of communities that weren't part of that mainstream population and didn't have the same political power. And so in the US, environmental justice relates specifically to the movement that seeks to fix that and redress the issues of these communities. As we were thinking about environmental justice in the global scale, what we were looking at is, who are these communities? Well, it's communities that are not part of the power structure, that are not part of the that don't have the same political power and economic power as those people in charge, and so are then either they're prejudiced against, they don't have the same recourse. And so that's how we were looking to actually make that distinction in other places where obviously the same issues at the US didn't play out exactly the same way. So and again, you see here the plastic death cycle, and that's because I refuse to call it a life cycle. The plastic death cycle from extraction to waste is, and you see our report, there's several case studies. It's an issue that even in the US, even in California, even in places that are have a very strong environmental reputation and so-called leadership, you can see that there's a big difference between people that are communities that are wealthy and powerful, and where some of these things are actually cited. For example, one of the issues, and it's very well known at this point, one of the issues that we're looking at is a location outside of New Orleans that has the only neoprene production, or rather the neoprene base production factory in the US, and also happens to have the highest, one of the highest incidence of cancer and the risks of cancer. Now, one of the things that we saw was that because plastic is so prevalent and so widespread, it's very hard to create actual studies where you have the opportunity to isolate folks and really do control groups, etc., to evaluate these problems, because it's everywhere and it's very hard to keep people away from that. So that's something that we do have to highlight. And again, what we were able to point to is, well, you know, without being able to carry out studies that have control groups and have those protocols in place, we had to look at places that had one-off. So this is the only factory. This is also the only place in the US that has that incidence of cancer and that risk of cancer. And next slide. And so here we put it a little bit more clearly, and this is half of a page that's in our report. And so, you know, these are the impacts, right? We talk about waste, we talk about disposal and incineration, but really in this conversation, we don't talk enough about these earlier ones, right? Extraction. If you talk to the communities in what they call the Deep South and in the Deep Gulf, in Texas, in Port Comfort, etc., in Louisiana, they can talk to you again about the issue, even in Houston, what it's like to live in, this is what we call the fence line communities, right? They're right on the fence, right? And the basically the first people impacted, they're the ones having to deal with the fracking and the actual refining, etc. Folks like Fence Line Watch, which is a fabulous group led by Yvette, talk about how they have to deal and live their daily lives with, you know, gas and the gas that gets thrown out on a regular basis, the accidents, the fires, etc. And that's something that for the most part, actually, that particular area is a enormous, I was going to make up a word there, an enormous petrochemical location that is still being built out, by the way, that people are still trying to expand. And then we go to manufacturing. Obviously, like this is where we go to the place in Louisiana. And again, by no means am I trying to say that this is something that is only happens in the US. Where I'm from in Mexico, we see this again all over the place. The use and market penetration, this is something that, like I said, it's very hard to test. I hope that we can get to a place where we can, but it's very hard to test. We obviously have heard about the issues of now we have apparently microplastics found in our bloodstreams. But one of the issues, for example, that I found very interesting, there's a couple of studies coming out of Mexico, Dr. Cano, and he was talking about how in some cases, for example, growing up in Mexico, a lot of the water is not actually, sorry, that's my daughter. It's not actually potable, so you can't drink it out of the faucet. And so people will say, well, you know, you have to have the plastic bottles because the water's not there. People need to drink water, obviously. And what happens is that there's a study that looks at, well, actually, when you have this plastic infrastructure, what ends up happening is that you wash the hands of the government because they don't have actually, you know, it is their responsibility to provide this resource. And when you have the plastic bottles, and sorry, this is my daughter again, you will see this issue where government just doesn't have that rush. And in some cases, it's, you know, a problem that goes on. And for decades as Mexico, we still don't have potable water. And waste. So waste is the problem that you know the most, obviously, disposal, incineration. When you talk about chemical recycling, when you talk about, you know, making it into energy, and this country has run out of waste and now they're, et cetera, we have to look again at where things are getting done, how is it impacting the public, and more importantly, and in this part of our conversation in the report, you know, when we talk about these problems, it's like, where are we exporting the problems? Are we actually doing the disposal? There's also, as we have the issue of you know, the disparities in power and access to funds, et cetera, it also works out on a global scale. So you have obviously the countries that on one week they're getting lauded all over the world, and they're getting all the headlines by stopping, you know, having the fabulous proclamations of no more single-use plastic, and the next week they have containers of toxic waste being sent, and plastic waste sent to like poorer countries. So that's Canada, by the way, that we caught with the stuff in Indonesia. So it's very important that we talk about environmental justice also in that global scale. Next slide. And so we have, this is a little bit of what, where we went to the actual Sustainable Development Goals. We actually went through every single one of the 17, and we found, if not an impediment entirely, we found plastic to be an issue in all of them. Obviously, like we talk about clean water and sanitation, is this plastic actually solving a problem, or is it delaying a solution? Gender equality, who gets to do this work? Who actually has to do, who's more impacted, and we can, there's a video at the end that I'll link to. The goal 8, for example, the people in decent work and economic growth, there's a place here in pardon my US and Mexico centric examples, but there's a place here near San Francisco, which again, fairly liberal city. Everybody talks about this, you know, environmental liberal city, and at the same time, 20 minutes away from San Francisco, there's somewhere called Richmond that has a very large refinery. Actually, it has many refineries, and they have the what they call the iron triangle, because it's a very you know, industrial place. And that plant has been there for decades and decades and decades. And now people say, well, you know, there's many, I don't know what the word is in English right now, but there's many spills rather. There's issues, people have to deal with the air quality, et cetera. And now the conversation is like, well, you know, Richmond people should be really happy that they still have that plant because there's no other job. What they've managed to forget is that before this refinery was there, they had a very large Ford plant that had a lot less emissions. And what happened is that this Ford plant left once the refineries came in because it was very dangerous and unstable for them. So we have to look at the context of things and not just talk about like, well, they're lucky they have that. Right now, is this actually an impediment to other less toxic economic opportunities, right? So yes, I know I'm running into time. So we went through all of these, and it's a problem throughout. And I think that's the last. Again, we reviewed a number of agreements. As I talked about the issue of environmental justice on a global scale, they're very good starts, but frankly, we really need, what is the conversation lately, right? We need a globally binding agreement that puts everybody on the same path and actually puts everybody to work together. Because right now what we have still has, obviously we have an issue, we still have problems to solve. And while the agreements that we have are very good in certain degrees, we still have many loopholes there, and that's what the idea is with this new, if you saw the news, with this new mandate to negotiate a globally binding treaty. And so again, if you go to our report, you will see the 6 categories that we have, the recommendations for each one of them. So if you're a government, you you should actually be creating baselines. You should create opportunities for education for the public, especially as it relates to their human rights, to their exposure to hazardous waste, etc. You should obviously step in with regulation, collaborate with NGOs and other governmental folks, looking into if you are a large consumer, if you are, and this is something we have seen in places where government uses the power of their purchasing and the number of their purchasing to drive the market, right? And obviously stepping into the advocacy and not only doing the regulation internally, but stepping into agreements and treaties like the one we just mentioned. Yep, sorry. And I think that's it. And so our biggest issue here is, as we talk about both the Sustainable Development Goals and plastic, we have to really make sure that the most people that are the most impacted and the people that have the least resources or the least access to power and institutions are the ones that are prioritized, because again, because of that same thing, that's the problem. It's very exciting to see that that was a conversation that was centered and really driving in the talks in Nairobi last 2 months ago. So I think that there is a very big change that we're starting to see in the public discourse and government discourse about not just having, you know, not small solution, but short-sighted solutions, and actually looking at the whole global death cycle, as I said, of everything. Thank you.
So yes, it's been an incredible 2 days. We've had speakers from all over the world, including India, Spain, the US, Galapagos, Brazil, Philippines, Cameroon, and many other places. And I think, as I mentioned before, we've really crossed multiple disciplines across the topic of ocean plastic pollution through a systems change lens. And we've had these multiple perspectives, but there's been so many overlaps as well. And I think that's been something that's been really interesting and encouraging, that while people may not have known each other's work before, that they're actually sort of working in similar ways on similar issues. And there is this sort of interconnectedness between a lot of the things we've been discussing and the issues that we're addressing, and that again we keep coming back to a lot of these things aren't happening in isolation, and that, you know, again, that there's not necessarily one solution to this. We need ecological interventions, political and technological interventions, and it's not necessarily just about pushing a single issue, like obviously one less focused on single-use plastic bottles, which was incredibly important, but there was always a recognition that that was just one part of the problem. And I think this all comes back to this idea that, you know, we're not going to manage this alone, that, you know, collaboration is so important as part of what we're trying to do. And again, you know, if we achieve one thing from this, is that people may start making linkages with those that they've not before, that are trying to do similar things in a different place or using a different method, and that you know, is a real strength of symposiums such as this. I feel it's only appropriate that one of the co-organisers has the last word, although I will be back for some housekeeping at the end. So I'm going to hand over now to Fiona Llewellyn from ZSL, who led the One Less project and was really one of the driving forces behind this whole symposium.
Thanks, Matt. That's really kind of you to give me the last word, although I guess you might regret that. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, I mean, sort of having co-founded and worked on the One Less project with colleagues both at ZSL and some of our collaborators today, it was a real sort of big partnership project that was all about plastic, stopping plastic at source and taking a systemic change approach. Is something that's been close to my heart over the past sort of 6 years or so. So when we were thinking about organising this this symposium, we thought it perhaps might be a little bit indulgent. However, I think seeing the breadth and scope and richness of topics, discussion and interdisciplines that have been represented across the past 2 days, I mean, I think we're very glad that we did organise it. As Andrew mentioned this morning, there's often a lack of unity across the conservation sector, as much as we try, which does hinder our progress. And I think system change approaches really do speak to addressing this and building a much more collaborative and holistic way forward. That's something that's been, again, demonstrated by our speakers and by all of us coming together over the past couple of days to learn so much from each other. So huge thanks for that. Just a few further reflections from me. I think, you know, I think we've all agreed that plastic has become the visible face of humankind's lack of value, I suppose, and poor interaction with nature. We've seen some really emotive imagery today, and you know, even this afternoon, James's photos of the plastic river in Kenya, and much more throughout the conference. The symposium. We've heard that plastic can provide a great place to start when we're often overwhelmed by the magnitude of environmental issues, and it can provide those inroads, that sort of gateway approach to galvanise people about other environmental ocean issues. And as NGOs and scientists and environmental practitioners, I guess it's up to us to kind of try and use these levers to achieve more systemic change that can cover more of these issues in a quicker way while we're up against that ticking time bomb. But also, as we heard earlier, that we need to be careful that plastic isn't distracting from other issues. So certainly there's a balancing act to be done there. And the importance of communication is certainly permeated throughout all of our sessions. I particularly like Marcella's phrase about the plastic death cycle rather than the plastic life cycle. I think that's something that I might adopt going forward. Something else that really resonated with me was the discussions around planetary boundaries. They were particularly interesting. And throughout today, there's really been a strong link between biodiversity loss, climate and plastic. And an agreement, I think, from everybody that we need to try and communicate about these holistically where we can and where it's appropriate to do so. We had some great ambitions and commitments from the UK government, promising action with the UN Plastic Treaty. And we know that this now needs to be turned into action. I think Lisa Ann also earlier made the excellent point that it's the same fossil fuel producers that are contributing to the climate change that are the source of the plastic production and pollution. So that's demonstrating to me that there really needs to be true accountability and transparency, hopefully something that the Plastic Treaty can help us achieve. And on the collaboration point, and Matt just mentioned again now, I just don't think it can be stressed enough. Like any conservation intervention, involving stakeholders at all stages and really listening to those stakeholders, not making assumptions about them and drawing on their local knowledge is vital. And as is that coordinated effort across all sectors. I think the fact that we do know that nobody wants plastic in the ocean is something that we can all agree on. While we've had some interesting talks about the need for evidence, I think we all know that, as Tanya just mentioned clearly, plastic doesn't have a place in our aquatic systems. So we need to keep acting to shift those systems so that it's the misuse and the mismanagement of plastic that we need to be dramatically reduced.